So we now move on and look at the structure of the skeleton. This is what the skeleton looks like. The skeleton, the human skeleton. Observe these visuals keenly and carefully. The skeleton has or is made up of different parts. To begin from here, this is the skull. The skull. The whole of it is the skull. We could call it the skull or call it the cranium. It has a part which we are calling the cranium. The skeleton or the image on one side is labeling parts. The image on the other side shows the alternative names. The alternative names of those parts of the skeleton. That is why we see we are calling this the skull. We can as well call it the cranium. The cranium. However, when you look at the cranium, look at the skeleton on the right. The cranium has some joints. It has some joints which are immovable. It has joints that are immovable. Those immovable joints we are going to see, we call them the sutures. We are going to come to them, the sutures. But when we talk of the skull is made of this bone which you are calling the cranium, that one at the front, just like we see it labeled there. But it is even made of the jaw, the jaw bones, these ones, the bones of the jaw, where we find the teeth or the mandibles. So these teeth are attached onto what we are calling the jaw bone, the skull or cranium and the jaw bone. But when we talk of the jaw, what do we find there? The teeth. The teeth. Then, from there, we have this bone here, which we call the clavicle, also called the collarbone. In some people, it's very prominent, this bone here, that runs from one end to the other. That is the clavicle, also called the collarbone. Skull. Jaw, bones with teeth, skull or cranium, then jaw bones with the teeth, then we have the collarbone, call it the clavicle. Then from the collarbone or from the clavicle, at the shoulder here, at the shoulder, there is a bone here. When you press, there is a bone here. This bone is what we call the shoulder blade. Here, we call it the shoulder blade, also called the scapula. Clavicle, then scapula, that one there. However, at the front, there is another bone here. When you press, try to press here. That bone is what you're calling the sternum or the breast bone. It is found at the point where we have the breasts. Therefore, we call it the breast bone. Skull, the cranium, then the jaw bones, then we have clavicle, we have scapula, we have collarbone, also called the breast bone. Then we have the ribs. These are the ribs, just like we see from the visuals. These are the ones we are calling the ribs, making up what we call the rib cage. The ribs making up the rib cage. But in addition, we have a set of bones from the base of the skull running through up to the waist. From the base of your skull running through the behind part up to the waist. Those bones collectively form what we call the backbone, because it is found in your back, from the base here of the skull running through your back up to the waist area. We call it the backbone. But you're going to see that the backbone is made of a group of bones called vertebrae. That is why the backbone is also called the vertebral column. Vertebral column. It is a column made up of those bones called vertebrae. The skull, cranium, mandible or the jaw bone with the teeth, clavicle or collarbone, scapula, sternum, ribs making up the rib cage, then backbone or vertebral column made up of vertebrae. Then when you come to the forelimbs, there is one bone here which we are calling the humerus. From the humerus there are two bones here. There are two bones here, one called the radius, another one called the ulna. This is the forearm. This is the upper arm. Therefore, the humerus called the upper arm bone. Then we have the radius and the ulna, the forearm bones. Then at this point here, we have bones as well. We have the first bones called the carpals. Then here we have another set called the metacarpals, and here there are small bones called the phalanges. Called the phalanges. So we have this bone, humerus, then we have radius and ulna, then we have the carpals, then the metacarpals, and then the phalanges. Skull, mandible, collarbone or clavicle, sternum, scapula, ribs making up the rib cage, vertebral column or the backbone made of vertebrae. Then we have humerus, radius and ulna, then carpals, metacarpals, and then the phalanges. Then from the west, we have what we call the pelvis. The pelvis, or the bone generally called the hip bone. Then in your thigh, there is a long bone called the femur, or the thigh bone. Where the thigh ends, where that bone ends, the femur, at your knee, when you touch your knee, there is that swollen bone which appears or feels to be round. That round bone is called the kneecap, also called the patella. At the knee, kneecap or patella. Then in the lower part of the leg, we have two bones there. There is the big one called the tibia and another small one called the fibula, just like we see from our image there. The tibia and the fibula. Then at the point where they end, they join to the foot. Where they join to the foot, at the ankle, we have what we call the ankle bones, also called the tarsus. Then in the foot, we have the metatarsals, and these end in the toes with what we're calling the phalanges. So those are the bones of the skeleton. Now don't be worried of the structure of the skeleton. You can't be asked to draw that skeleton, no. So don't load your head with drawing the skeleton. But we can be asked to label the bones, because we need to know where these bones are. We may find a question whereby a part of the skeleton is drawn, just a part of it, and then you're asked to label the bones making up that part of the skeleton. So it's important that we get to know which part is which. Which part is which. Just like we have seen from the skull up to the phalanges. Take a minute or take some seconds. Look through those images And again, try to familiarize yourselves with those bones so that we know where each is found. So those are the parts of the skeleton. So we are going to see that it is divided greatly into two, but those are the individual parts of the skeleton.